4 years, the laughter was the only thing anyone talked about. Two guys crash through a door, deliver one ridiculous line, and an entire studio audience loses its mind. It happened week after week, season after season, and nobody ever got tired of it. Lenny and Squiggy were not just supporting characters on Laverne and Shirley. They were something rarer and harder to manufacture. They were genuinely, inexplicably, almost dangerously funny. And for decades, the full story of how they got there, what really happened behind those cameras, and what Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall actually thought about the whole wild ride stayed buried beneath the applause. Until now. Because when you go back and piece together the interviews, the memoirs, the late-night talk show confessions, and the candid moments that slipped through over the years, a much richer story emerges. One that starts not on a soundstage in Hollywood, but in a living room in Los Angeles, where a casual party became an accidental audition that nobody planned and nobody forgot. Penny Marshall was not known for doing things the conventional way. She was sharp, direct, and allergic to anything that felt forced or phony. So when people gathered at her home in the mid-1970s, and they gathered often, because Penny and her then-husband Rob Reiner ran the kind of household where writers, actors, and comedians showed up regularly and stayed late, the atmosphere was loose and real. Nobody was performing for a job. Nobody was trying to impress a producer. It was just people being themselves. On one particular evening, two men named David Lander and Michael McKean were among the guests. Both were already known in certain comedy circles as members of the Credibility Gap, a Los Angeles-based satirical group that had built a devoted following through sharp political humor, musical parody, and the kind of ensemble chemistry that only develops after years of performing together. They were funny men. Everyone in the room knew that. But what happened next surprised even people who thought they had seen everything. Without warning, without build-up, without any signal that something was about to shift, David and Michael became two entirely different people. They slipped into characters. Exaggerated, bizarre, oddly specific characters with strange postures, clashing accents, and a conversational rhythm that felt like it had been running for years inside some alternate universe. The room stopped. Then the room erupted. Penny watched it happen and felt something click in her brain that she would later describe as immediate and undeniable. She was not watching two actors showing off. She was watching two people reveal something that had been living inside them for a long time. Cindy Williams, who heard about the evening shortly after, would later say that when Penny described what she had witnessed, the enthusiasm in her voice was unlike anything Cindy normally associated with her co-star and close friend. Penny was not easily dazzled. She had grown up around show business, had seen talented people come and go, and had developed a healthy skepticism about overnight discoveries. But this was different. These two men had something that could not be taught, coached, or constructed in a writer's room. They had genuine comic instinct, and it was attached to characters that already felt complete. Laverne and Shirley had launched in January 1976 as a spin-off of Happy Days, and the response had been extraordinary. Audiences connected immediately with Penny's Laverne DeFazio and Cindy's Shirley Feeney, two working-class women in 1950s Milwaukee sharing an apartment, sharing a job at the Schatz Brewery, and sharing the daily chaos of trying to build a life with limited resources and unlimited determination. The show was warm, physical, and genuinely funny. But producer Gary Marshall, Penny's older brother and the architect behind the whole enterprise, was always thinking about balance. Gary Marshall had a philosophy about comedy that he applied with almost mathematical precision. Every successful sitcom, in his view, required contrast. You needed characters who were striving, reaching, and hoping, and you needed characters who existed somewhere below that stratum, whose presence made the strivers look almost competent by comparison. It was not mean-spirited. It was structural. Comedy lives in the gap between aspiration and reality, and the wider you could make that gap feel, the more room you had to work with. When Penny brought David and Michael to his attention, Gary recognized immediately what they could provide. Here were two performers who could walk into any scene, regardless of its emotional temperature, and reset the entire room. They could interrupt a tender moment without destroying it. They could escalate absurdity without losing the audience's affection. They were, in Gary's framing, the pressure valves that every well-built sitcom needed. The characters whose arrival signaled to the viewer that whatever tension had been building was about to be spectacularly released. The informal audition on the soundstage confirmed everything Penny had described from the party. David and Michael arrived, slipped into their characters, and proceeded to do to a room full of television professionals exactly what they had done to a living room full of friends. The laughter was not polite or encouraging. It was involuntary. Cindy Williams later recalled standing there watching them and feeling the strange sensation of knowing she was seeing something that would outlast the moment. Some performances you appreciate. Some performances you remember. And some performances you simply cannot believe you were present for. What most people never knew. What Penny Marshall eventually revealed in interviews that did not get nearly the attention they deserved, was that the characters who became Lenny and Squiggy were not born fully formed. There was an earlier version, a rougher draft, and it involved a name that never made it to air. In the original conception, the character paired with Lenny was named Anthony. He was written as an Italian-American neighborhood guy, broadly drawn, meant to complement Lenny's energy with a familiar ethnic flavor that fit the show's Milwaukee working-class setting. The problem, as Penny explained it bluntly, was that the show already had Italian characters. Frank DeFazio was Italian. Carmine Ragusa was Italian. The cultural landscape of the series was already well populated in that direction, and adding another Italian character felt less like texture and more like redundancy. So the writers went back to work, and Andrew Squigman, Squiggy, emerged from that revision. The change was not cosmetic. Renaming a character and reconceiving his background opened up creative space that the Anthony version simply did not have. Squiggy could be stranger, less defined, more elastic. His oddness did not need to be explained or rooted in anything recognizable. He existed in a category of his own, and that freedom made him funnier. The name itself was part of the joke. Short, sharp, slightly ridiculous, the kind of word that sits funny in your mouth whether you are saying it or hearing it. Cindy Williams spoke about this transformation with genuine appreciation in later years. She noted that once the character became Squiggy, everything else about the duo sharpened. The dynamic between the two men clarified. Their entrances became more reliable as comic events because the characters themselves felt more distinct, more themselves. You cannot fully quantify what a name contributes to a character, but anyone who has ever tried to imagine Andrew Squigman being named Anthony instead will understand immediately that something essential would have been lost. The public version of the Laverne and Shirley story was always a happy one. And in many respects, it genuinely was. The show ran for 8 seasons, produced some of the most beloved physical comedy in American television history, and gave its cast members careers and cultural identities that lasted far beyond its final episode. But Penny Marshall and Cindy Williams were both candid, in their own ways and on their own timelines, about the fact that the experience was also complicated, demanding, and occasionally bruising. What both women consistently acknowledged, and this is where the story of Lenny and Squiggy becomes unexpectedly poignant, was that David Lander and Michael McKean brought something to the set that was genuinely sustaining. On days when the writing was difficult, when the schedule was punishing, when the internal pressures of a successful television production were pressing down on everyone involved, Lenny and Squiggy showed up and reminded the cast what the show was fundamentally about. It was about making people laugh in a way that felt honest. Not sophisticated, not stylized, not carefully constructed for awards consideration. Just honest, immediate, unguarded laughter. Penny was not a woman who handed out compliments casually. She was direct to the point that people sometimes mistook her honesty for coldness. But when she talked about David and Michael, something softened. She talked about their generosity as performers, the way they never tried to pull focus beyond what the scene needed, the way they understood instinctively that their job was to enhance the story rather than redirect it. They came in, they did the thing that only they could do, and they made everyone around them look good in the process. Cindy echoed that sentiment in her own way, noting that Lenny and Squiggy represented a kind of purity in the show's comic identity. They were not complicated by backstory or burdened by narrative arc. They were exactly what they appeared to be, which made them, paradoxically, the most honest characters on the screen. Television has produced countless memorable duos. But the specific combination that David Lander and Michael McKean created as Lenny and Squiggy occupies a category that resists easy comparison. They were not straight man and clown. They were not foils for each other in any conventional sense. They were two people who shared a wavelength so specific and so peculiar that existing near it was inherently funny. The humor did not come from contrast between them. It came from the complete, unapologetic consistency of who they were, together, separately, in any room they entered. What Penny Marshall and Cindy Williams ultimately revealed, across years of interviews and reflections that accumulated long after the show ended, was that the secret of Lenny and Squiggy was never really a secret at all. It was visible from the very first night, in that living room in Los Angeles, when two men stopped being themselves and became something that was somehow more real than reality. The characters existed before the show needed them. The show was simply lucky enough to find them. Gary Marshall built his comedy on the principle that every ladder needed every rung, and that the bottom rung was not a lesser position, it was a load-bearing one. Without Lenny and Squiggy grounding the chaos at the foundation, the whole structure would have been missing something it could not have named but would absolutely have felt. Cindy Williams passed away in January 2023. Penny Marshall had left years before, in December 2018. But the laughter they helped create, the laughter that started in a living room and spread across a decade of American television, still lands. It still works. Because great comedy, the kind built on real instinct and real chemistry and real understanding of what makes people feel something true, does not age. It just waits for the next audience to discover it. And somewhere in that story, the door opens, and two leather jackets fill the frame, and before a single word is spoken, the room is already laughing.